Before he ever wore a uniform, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a force of nature. Born into poverty in 1821 in rural Tennessee, Forrest had no formal education. He was barely literate, but he was sharp, calculating, and driven by a fire few could match. By the time most men were starting families, Forrest was already a self-made millionaire. He made his fortune trading land, livestock, and, tragically, enslaved people, part of the Southern economy's brutal underbelly. His reputation as a businessman was ruthless. If Forrest shook your hand in a deal, you walked away, either rich or ruined. He stood over 6 feet tall with piercing eyes and a violent temper. He was known to settle disputes with a pistol or a blade, and legend holds he killed more than a dozen men before the war even started. Some say he was terrifying. Others say he was magnetic. Either way, no one ignored Nathan Bedford Forrest. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Forrest was already wealthy and middle-aged. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't graduated from West Point or studied military tactics. But the moment the South needed men to fight, Forrest volunteered and paid to raise and equip an entire battalion out of his own pocket. He enlisted as a private. Within months, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. This was no accident. In his first encounters on the battlefield, Forrest shocked everyone. He didn't follow the book because he had never read the book, but his instincts were brutal and effective. He moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before Union troops could catch him. He didn't just lead from the rear, he led every charge from the front, saber drawn, shouting orders as bullets whistled past his head. Soldiers followed him not out of loyalty, but because in the chaos of battle, he seemed invincible. By the time the war had reached its second year, Forrest had built a legend. His men called him that Devil Forrest. Union generals began to fear his cavalry more than regular armies. He became the embodiment of irregular Southern warfare, swift, unpredictable, merciless. But behind the legend, there was something darker. Forrest's rise in the Confederate ranks wasn't just about battlefield brilliance, it was about brutality. He showed no mercy to enemies who resisted. He operated by a code of fear. And as he climbed the ranks, from colonel to brigadier general, he left behind a trail of stories, some heroic, others horrific. He wasn't a man who belonged to any one image. He was chaos given flesh. In the words of one of his enemies, Forrest is the only man I ever feared. This is where the story begins. A man with no formal training, no pedigree, no limits. A man who would redefine cavalry warfare, and a man whose name still sparks controversy over a century later. April 12, 1864. Fort Pillow, Tennessee. A Confederate cavalry force, led by Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, approached the Union-held outpost along the Mississippi River. It was garrisoned by a mix of white Tennessee Unionists and nearly 300 black soldiers, members of the United States colored troops. Most of them were formerly enslaved men, and this made the battle that was about to unfold far more than a tactical maneuver. It became a symbol. From the moment Forrest's men arrived, they demanded unconditional surrender. When the request was refused, Forrest launched a furious assault. His troops stormed the steep bluff, outflanked the Union defenders, and quickly overwhelmed the fort's outer defenses. The Union commander, Major Lionel Booth, was killed early in the attack, and chaos spread through the ranks. By late afternoon, Union resistance had collapsed. What happened next remains one of the most controversial and contested episodes of the Civil War. As Confederate troops flooded into the fort, Union soldiers, especially black troops, began to throw down their arms. Some tried to flee. Others begged for mercy. But what they received was a bloodbath. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, Forrest's men continued to fire long after Union troops had ceased resistance. Soldiers were shot, bayoneted, or clubbed as they tried to surrender. Many were burned alive inside buildings set ablaze. The numbers were staggering. Of the nearly 300 black soldiers stationed at Fort Pillow, over 60% were killed. By contrast, white Union troops, those who survived, were far more likely to be taken prisoner. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. To Union commanders and abolitionists, this was not war. It was massacre. It was revenge. It was racial terror. News of the slaughter spread quickly. Northern newspapers erupted in outrage. Politicians demanded retaliation. The phrase, "Remember Fort Pillow," became a rallying cry for black troops across the Union Army. President Lincoln was briefed. Congressional hearings were held. Testimonies painted a horrifying picture of what took place that day. Men shot in the back, execution style. Bodies mutilated, wounded soldiers buried alive. Forrest denied it was a massacre. He claimed that the Union forces had continued to resist, that many had been shot while trying to escape, not surrender. His defenders said it was the heat of battle. Confusion, misunderstanding. But for many, the facts spoke too loudly. Even Confederate soldiers privately admitted the brutality of what they had witnessed. One Southern officer wrote home, saying the attack on Fort Pillow was an atrocity. This event would haunt Forrest for the rest of his life. Though he was never tried or convicted for war crimes, the Fort Pillow massacre became an enduring scar on his legacy. It revealed not just the horrors of war, but the deep racial hatred that fueled so much of it. The man once admired for his courage had now become, in the eyes of the North, a butcher. But Forrest's war was far from over. After Fort Pillow, he did not retreat or hide. Instead, he doubled down, launching a string of raids that left Union supply lines in ruins and entire towns in fear. By 1864, Nathan Bedford Forrest had become the most unpredictable threat the Union faced in the Western theater. His tactics were unorthodox. His forces were usually outnumbered. Yet his raids left Union columns paralyzed, supply lines severed, and morale in tatters. Forrest wasn't fighting a conventional war. He was waging psychological warfare. He understood something many Confederate generals did not: how to weaponize fear, chaos, and mobility. With fewer than 3,000 men, Forrest conducted raids that felt like full-scale invasions. He moved with eerie speed, often striking and vanishing before Union troops knew he was in the area. In the spring of 1864, he led a raid deep into Union territory, seizing Jackson, Tennessee, and destroying miles of railroads and supply depots. The Union command scrambled to respond. Generals sent entire divisions chasing shadows. Forrest's ability to strike behind enemy lines had made him a ghost, an ever-present, invisible threat. Then came the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads in June 1864. It was Forrest's masterpiece. With just 3,500 men, he faced a Union force of over 8,000. The Union troops were better supplied and numerically superior, but they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated Nathan Bedford Forrest. He lured them into narrow, swampy terrain, stretched their lines, and then struck with brutal precision. His cavalry dismounted and fought like infantry. His artillery hammered the enemy flanks, and at the moment the Union line began to buckle, Forrest led a ferocious cavalry charge that shattered them. It wasn't just a victory, it was humiliation. The Union army was routed. They left behind weapons, wagons, and over 1,500 casualties. Forrest had won the most lopsided Confederate victory of the war. Even Union generals couldn't help but marvel. William Tecumseh Sherman famously called him "that devil Forrest," and admitted he'd have to be killed to be stopped. But killing Forrest proved difficult. His raids continued throughout the summer. He tore through Memphis in a surprise attack aimed at capturing Union officers. He disrupted telegraph lines, burned trains, and captured thousands of prisoners. Yet, every victory Forrest won came at a cost. Union resolve hardened. More troops were redirected to stop him, and within the Confederacy, his legend was growing. But so was unease about his recklessness and the trail of destruction he left behind. Still, for many in the South, Forrest had become a symbol of resistance, a man who refused to lose, who embodied the Southern war spirit more than any polished general in Richmond. But behind the victories was a man growing darker, more extreme. His fury was no longer just aimed at Union forces. It was becoming political, racial, and deeply personal. And after the war, that fury would not vanish with the Confederacy's defeat. It would find a new shape, a new symbol, one that would haunt America for generations. When the Confederacy collapsed in 1865, many of its generals vanished into quiet disgrace or fled the country altogether. But Nathan Bedford Forrest was not a man who faded quietly. Though he officially surrendered and even gave a speech urging his troops to accept peace, his war was far from over. He returned to a South that was shattered. Cities burned, railroads twisted into useless iron, its economy ruined. Former slaves were now free men. Union troops patrolled Southern streets. To men like Forrest, this was not just defeat. It was humiliation. But the battlefield had changed. No longer were battles fought with rifles and cavalry charges. Now it was fought with politics, fear, and identity. The post-war South became a breeding ground for something darker, something Forrest would soon become tied to. In 1866, a group of Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed a fraternal order meant to resist Reconstruction. They called it the Ku Klux Klan. What began as a secret society for ex-soldiers quickly morphed into a paramilitary force that aimed to restore white supremacy by any means necessary. They used hoods to hide their faces, night raids to terrify freedmen, and murder as a political tool. By 1867, Forrest was named the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Exactly how involved he was remains debated. Some claim he was a symbolic leader. Others insist he was the architect behind the group's rapid rise. What is undeniable is this. Under Forrest's leadership, the Klan transformed from a regional curiosity into a national threat. Night riders lynched black citizens, intimidated white Republicans, and targeted schools and churches that supported black education. The Klan became a ghost army of the South, riding under the banner of racial terror. And at its helm was the man once called the Devil of the Confederacy. But by 1869, even Forrest claimed to have grown disturbed by the violence. He issued a public call for the Klan to disband, saying its purpose had been fulfilled. Whether this was genuine remorse or a strategic retreat in the face of federal investigations is unclear. The damage, however, had been done. Forrest's post-war image split into two. To some, he was still a Southern hero, a brilliant commander who had simply fought for his homeland. To others, he was the father of American domestic terror, a man who transitioned from military warfare to psychological warfare against newly freed black Americans. His life had become a contradiction. a former slave trader who claimed to want peace. A Confederate general who once urged black citizens to build a life in the South. A military genius whose greatest legacy was wrapped in blood and fear. By the time he died in 1877, Forrest was both admired and despised. In Southern memory, he became a romantic symbol of resistance. In American history, he became one of its most controversial figures. But the story of Nathan Bedford Forrest doesn't end with his death. It lives on in statues, in protests, in debates about memory and justice. His legacy continues to shape how America confronts its past, and how it defines its heroes and villains. Long after the smoke of the Civil War cleared and the man himself was laid in a Memphis grave, Nathan Bedford Forrest's legacy refused to rest. If war is a clash of armies, memory is a war of symbols, and Forrest became one of the most contested symbols in American history. In the early 20th century, as Jim Crow laws gripped the South, Forrest's memory was resurrected not with hesitation, but with pride. Statues of him were erected in city parks. Schools and highways bore his name. His image was polished into that of a Southern knight, gallant, fearless, loyal to his people. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was part of a calculated campaign to recast the Confederacy as noble and tragic, a movement now known as the Lost Cause. Forrest, with his explosive charisma and military brilliance, fit the role perfectly. Never mind the slave trading, never mind Fort Pillow, and certainly never mind the Ku Klux Klan. But memory is not static. It moves with the times. By the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, those same monuments became flashpoints. Black Americans and their allies saw not a hero, but a threat. A man who had fought to keep them enslaved and then terrorized them after their freedom. Marches and protests erupted. Activists demanded Forrest's name be removed from schools and public buildings. In the 21st century, that battle only intensified. In 2015, after the Charleston church shooting, the debate over Confederate monuments reignited nationwide. Forrest's statue in Memphis, towering over a city where so many black Americans lived, became a rallying point. Protesters gathered. Petitions circulated. Lawsuits were filed. Eventually, in 2017, under mounting public pressure, the city of Memphis removed the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest from Health Sciences Park. 2 years later, his remains were exhumed and relocated to a private Confederate cemetery. It wasn't just about a statue. It was about ownership of history. Who gets to tell the story? Who gets remembered as a hero? And who decides what a monument actually honors? Some still defend Forrest. They point to his battlefield genius, his post-war speeches advocating peace, even a late-life outreach to black communities. They claim his sins have been exaggerated for political reasons. Others argue that no military brilliance can erase the stains of slavery, massacre, and racial terror. That remembering Forrest with reverence sends a message, not just about the past, but about the future we want to build. In the end, Nathan Bedford Forrest became more than a man. He became a mirror, one that reflects back the soul of a nation divided over how it sees itself. To some, he's a folk hero, to others, a symbol of hatred. And that may be the most enduring battlefield of all, the battlefield of memory. So now, the question returns to us, the viewers, the citizens, the descendants of history. What do we do with men like Nathan Bedford Forrest? Erase them, enshrine them, or confront them fully without illusion or excuse? The story does not end with the past. It lives on in every argument, every protest, every classroom. Because how we remember history is how we shape tomorrow.